Hi there. Let's talk about graphic narratives. In this lecture, we're going to look at the role of the alternative press in comics. We're going to move away from the mainstream publishers of Marvel and DC and look at how small press publications have greatly influenced the direction of comics in the latter half of the 20th century. There is a long history of alternative press comics in the United States and elsewhere. To begin with, there have always been pornographic underground to the comic world, comics that were cheaply published, passed around in bars and nightclubs, and published by unknown publishers and created by unknown anonymous artists. And these comics often contained salacious stories of well-known characters from the movies or other comic pages that were now shown in these sort of titillating and seductive scenes. Tina Wild was the racist caricature of these publications, and there were about 700 to 1,000 different titles published from as early as 1920s and sort of largely disappeared in the 70s and 80s when pornography went online. The smallpox publications used a lot of well-known characters and featured them in ways that were insulting and parodic to kind of draw people in a sort of imaginative play to go where mainstream publications didn't dare go. They were kind of rebellious, but they really were just meant to sell the comics. They didn't really have any larger purpose other than to excite someone. These kinds of publications have continued to thrive in different ways, and we have a thriving zine culture, which we will talk about later. But this rebellious sentiment was brought to focus through a publication that started out really as an offshoot of EC Comics. Now, if you remember, EC Comics was very famous for its horror magazines, and we talked about those at science fiction magazines that they were very popular with. And Harvey Kurtzman, who had been an artist who worked in the war magazines and other comics, was asked to edit a humor magazine. So he started making parodies of the very comics that EC was famous for, horror comics. And these proved mildly interesting, but not terribly popular. It was only when Mad Comic decided to have one of its features a parody of Superman. Now, when they did this, they were, of course, a little nervous because they knew how litigious DC Comics was with their mainstay character, Superman. So they tried very hard to distance themselves from that character by making him a parody. Kurtzman had also been looking into copyright law, and he realized that something that was a parody was protected under fair use. And so with this small protection in its suit, they were able to come up with Super Duper Man, drawn by Wally Wood in 1953. And this new direction proved very popular with their readers. It took the mythology of Superman and just tore it to shreds, upending all the conventions and hypocrisies and all the other over-the-top exaggerations that made Superman super, and allowed the character to exist as a parody of itself. And we get to see this in the way that is drawn. There's this excess to everything, the sexuality, the abundance. And what made Wally Wood's drawing so much fun is he really upped this density of the drawing. Notice all these little kids that are sitting there laughing and adding an extra layer of commentary to all the other jokes that are going on. And they call these eye kicks, or chicken fat, the thing that gave the comic flavor. And this was a way to kind of exaggerate and bring out the comic to a degree that allowed people to want to read it again. You kind of read it once for the story, then you kind of go back and you start noticing all these other little side jokes that have been added in as well. Now, they didn't invent this idea. This is actually something that comes back to Bill Holman and Smokey Stover. You can see that all the little added signage and other jokes on top of the main humor is really what made the character quite fun and had a certain rebellious and anarchic quality about it. Now, what made this particular comic especially interesting was it wasn't just a parody of Superman, it was a parody of the comic industry as well. Because in this story of Super Duper Man, we see Super Duper Man unable to land a punch on Captain Marbles. And this is sort of what was going on in the comic industry. Captain Marvel, or Captain Marbles in this case, proved very popular. And there had been a long-standing lawsuit between National, which is what DC called itself at this time, and Fawcett, who owned Captain Marvel. DC had claimed that Captain Marvel was in violation of their copyright of Superman. And this went on for 14 years or more until finally Fawcett just sort of gave up the ghost and decided to kill off their own character. Hence, we have this final battle between the two characters. Superman by himself is not able to destroy this Captain Marbles, but he is able to sort of destroy himself. So fair use. Fair use is using some part of the character, but through exaggeration and distortion and parody, you're able to use it without actually using it, reproducing. You're creating something new, in effect, and you're commenting on something old. And these have to be very specific comments. It can't be a general parody. It has to be something very particular. And so this became the whole vocabulary of Mad Magazine. The very purpose for which Mad was created was to parody other sorts of magazines and comics, and they just ran with it. They also moved out from just doing other comics. They also took on mainstream publications like Life magazine with their beautiful Girl of the Month, drawn by Basil Wolverton, made a big splash on the cover of Mad magazine with his horrendously drawn Girl of the Month. Other strategies that were really novel to Mad Magazine was Bernard Krigstein's use of collage. Bernard Krigstein we also talked about in the section on EC Comics, where he was the artist who created Master Race. And as a humorist, he really proved very innovative, using collage in an ironic way, which is how it had been used in fine arts circles of Dada and Surrealism, and to kind of create a way of really referencing a theme or a moment without actually drawing it, and sort of highlighting the artificiality and the superficiality of this thing that's being copied or being made fun of in this case. They also took on the idea of fine art. In the art issue, they did a long-running series of stories about this artist known as Chicken Fat Elder, and they started calling all kinds of different household and ordinary objects art, such as this playing card, which was called the Abstract Djinn. And so what was happening in Mad was that it was a parody of everything that everyone took as the kind of sacred cows of American culture. And this was a really valuable experience for a lot of people who are sort of given culture as a sort of, this is what great culture is. To have Mad Magazine was just sort of blow a hole in all that pretension that was going on in the 1950s, when America was just so full of itself, so proud of all that it was. And it looked at a lot of different things. Like in this case here, we're seeing, ways in which books, focus on the nitty gritty, but then suddenly movies are all cleaned up and looking much more refined. And it often saw these sort of recurring jokes, such as the word potrzeby, which is a Polish word which was used strangely in a whole kinds of different situations, just a way to kind of bring the readership into a secret language, which was a sort of running gag between issues. The character that really stood for and became the main face for Mad Magazine, which was later known as Alfred Newman. And he first appeared in the issue number 33, 1957, as a part of a kind of fake ads that they were featuring in this issue. Now, prior to this time, Mad had been including some ads. And then when they started introducing fake ads that were parodying the very things that were in their magazine, their advertisers came and complained and said, "You can't do this. We can't sell our works and then you make fun of them on the page opposite." And so Mad, at that point, Max Gaines, who was in charge at this time, he decided that they would no longer have any ads in Mad. This gave them a certain amount of freedom to do what they want, say what they want, not being criticized by advertisers, and not trying to work toward the expectations of what Mad should be by what advertisers might want in the future. So with this, it became important with the Comics Code for Mad to cut loose a little bit more. And this is when the Mad magazine came about out of a comic book. It gave them more freedom. They didn't have to go and receive the Comics Code of authority. And Kurtzman, at this moment, really wanted full artistic control over his new production. He came and talked to Max Gaines and insisted that he give him complete control, a huge pay increase, and 50% of all the earnings off this new Mad magazine. Most of EC's titles were suffering, and Mad was just about the only comic that EC was making that was actually selling in any capacity. So Gaines refused to be blackmailed into this new agreement, and Feldstein left with all these top-tier artists in, and Gaines turned to an old friend, Al Feldstein, who had retired recently, and asked him to come back and steer Mad magazine into the future. Al Feldstein really transformed the magazine and created and brought on all kinds of new talent. And it was really from under the guidance of Al Feldstein that Mad really took the shape and form that it's really widely remembered for today. One artist who very characteristic of Mad magazine was Spy versus Spy, or which in this variation is Spy versus Spy versus Spy, and introduced this female character who was a foil to the black and the white. Now, this is during the Cold War, and Antonio Projas had escaped from Castro's Cuba in order to create comics in the United States. And he arrived not knowing any English, and he proposed this sort of visual comic. And they snapped it up, and it became a mainstay for many, many years to come. Other artists who really were very iconic, Sergio Aragones, who began by just drawing the tiny little marginal comics, again, like the eye kicks of years past. He began drawing all these little jokes that emerged from the margins of the character and eventually began taking on his own features. Sergio Aragones also was an enormously popular and prolific artist with his own graphic novels of the adventurer Groo, Groo. Another artist who was very distinctive, the characteristic of the modern Mad magazine, was Al Jaffe, who recently passed away. He was responsible for the final page, the back cover feature, which was called The Fold-In, which was a parody of the Playboy magazine, The Fold-Out. And in this sort of reverse way, he would create a picture, and then if you folded in the image, it would create a new picture with an entirely different meaning. And this was part of what Al Jaffe added, was this kind of twist on things. Again, social commentary, political ideas, all kinds of things came into Mad magazine. Mad reached its peak of popularity in the 1970s. It got into a lot of trouble publishing this cover in 1974. It resisted the demands that it publish a barcode on its cover. And so one of the ways it rebelled against that stipulation was that it published this front cover. Mad magazine eventually was owned by a DC and then a subsidiary of Time Warner. It was largely left to its own devices, though in around 2000, and it began to introduce advertising, which it had never done before, in a small way. And then in 2018, Time Warner was acquired by AT&T, and Mad, just a few months later, stopped producing all original content, and its staff of artists were laid off. So the legacy of Mad magazine is pretty much invisible in the sense that its success was really its own undoing. The internet and the way humor is spread through this diffuse means of memes and such really owes a great deal to the structure of humor that Mad magazine championed for so many decades. Harvey Kurtzman, after leaving EC Comics, decided he wanted to create his own humor magazine, and he began by going to the publisher of Playboy magazine, an old friend and acquaintance, and he got to create Help magazine in 1965, where he tried to create, again, this idea of a parody cartoon. This upstanding, good guy was the fall character who was constantly confronting the cynicism and the debauchery of modern society. In Goodman Goes Playboy, Goodman Beaver runs into his old friends from Ridgemont High, and he finds them all to be disaffected youths, drug users, playboys of the worst kind. Help magazine did not survive, and Kurtzman eventually began to produce a feature for Playboy magazine, Little Annie Fanny, a parody of Little Orphan Annie, which had a very similar kind of typeface that was used to publicize it. Little Annie Fanny is a fully adult woman who is constantly engaged in some kind of serious activity, but all of her attempts to create a genuine interest in something, in this case art, she is constantly being objectified by other men. And in this case, it's sort of a variation of Goodman Beaver. Goodman Beaver, who is always sort of shocked and upset by the debauchery of people around him. Now this innocent, buxom girl is the very subject, the very thing that is making people kind of crazy and debauched. Here you see in this episode of Little Annie Fanny, she is posing for an artist. Again, the way in which she's drawn, the extraordinary degree of artistry that Kurtzman brought to his construction. He really wanted to create something that was a comic for adults, a comic that had a kind of sophisticated artistry and attention to detail. And it had really gone out of the comic industry and the mainstream comic industry. But this feature in Playboy eventually was played out, and Kurtzman finished his career doing a number of projects which began to introduce the idea of the graphic novel.